If your reverbs don't sound right or don't sit well in your mix, this episode is going to help you fix this. We're going to get to the most common problems with reverbs, how to fix them, what to pay attention to, and some things that people commonly overlook. So let's dive into this. My name is Benedikt. I'm a mixing engineer. I run a studio called Outback Recordings. We mix a lot of songs here, over 200 every single year, 250 even, I think. And I'm also hosting this podcast, and I run a coaching platform called the Self-Recording Band, just like this podcast. And there we work with a lot of self-recording artists that we help with their DIY productions so they can make better recordings from their jam spaces and home studios. We do that through personal coaching in our different programs that we have there. And if you are new to the show, welcome. You're in the right spot if you want to learn things about home recording, DIY recording, how to get better results from your jam space, from your home studio. If you're already a listener, welcome back. Always good to have you. I'm here, as always, with my friend and co-host from Spain, Alicante, Manel Espinosa Berenguer. Hello.
Hello, Benedikt. As always, I'm really happy to be here. And as I always say, just in case you don't know me, I'm Manel Espinosa, and I'm a mixing engineer and music producer from Spain. Always happy to help you bring your demos to a finished song through a very lovely process.
Yes. Cool. So, Manel, we're talking reverb today. And I wanted to make this episode because I got a lot of questions on the topic of reverb lately, and the solution to these problems and the answers to these questions have been pretty much the same across the board. So I thought, let's just address them in this episode and help people listening to this podcast. Let me start by asking you a question, because it all starts by, choosing the right type of reverb. I'm not going to get too deep into this. I'm going to talk about how to set your reverb up correctly, but let me start by asking, which types of reverb do you have in your mixing template, if any? Maybe there's just one, maybe there's multiple, maybe you don't have a starting point. Like, what's the situation?
I have room reverb that it is kind of I have it on a bus, and that's the one that I use to send all kinds of things that I think would make sense to send there.
Yep.
Normally, I basically send a little bit of everything there, but nothing too crazy. And then I have different reverbs, one for the lead vocal, which I think currently is the Raum. I don't know how do you call it like that? Raum?
Yes.
Yeah.
Native instruments?
Yes.
Yeah, I love that one. That's really cool.
Orange one. And then I have the other, I think it's the blue one for the backing vocals. And I think maybe I have some other buses with other reverbs, but right now I don't really remember, to be honest.
All right. Yeah. So you said one very important thing there already, which is you have them on a bus. Mm-hmm. So before I get to that, this is one of the points that I wanted to talk about. Just make sure you have starting points for different situations like Manel just described. You should have a mixing template, not to make every song sound the same. That's not the point, but to have a good starting point and for every single mix. And also so that you can quickly reach for something, audition it, use it if it works, change it if it doesn't. But you don't want to pull up a new reverb plugin every single time. You need a reverb. You want to have some options ready to go in your template. So that's the one thing. I would highly recommend you spend a little bit of time researching the typical types of reverb. That is too much for this episode, but it's not too hard to research. Figure out what the difference is between room, hall, plate, spring, chamber. Those are basically the most common ones, I think. And then there's like specific sort of unusual stuff, of course, that you can use. But these like basic type of things that you find in pretty much every single reverb plugin, except for a few specialized tools. Figure out what those are, what the differences are in general in terms of their character. And just to give you a very quick overview, a room or an ambience is typically something that is a room that sounds relatively natural, relatively, oftentimes pretty dark. It depends on which type of room, but it's usually a more natural sounding, shorter ambience that doesn't have a long reverb tail. It puts things into a space as if it was recorded with room mics. That's the way I think about it. And there's always different ones, but that's in general how I think about it. A hall is similar in character, but bigger. So it's also relatively subtle, depending on the what's in that hall and all that, and depending on the patch. But in general, a hall is a realistic sounding, bigger type of ambience with a longer tail. It can be a concert hall, a jazz hall, some sort of large hall. Or smaller hall, whatever, but it's typically similar to a room, but bigger, the way I perceive it. A chamber is something to me that oftentimes sounds pretty bright and obvious, not as subtle, because it's like an empty echo chamber, reverb chamber with like empty walls and like obvious loud reverberation that can be really cool, but pretty obvious, not as subtle to blend in. A plate is a pretty characteristic all-round reverb that's great for drums, vocals, all kinds of things. There are bright plates, dark plates. It sounds to me, most often it sounds like an effect, not so much like a realistic thing. There are some that sound realistic, but in general, a plate is an effect more than anything. If I want to use a plate, I want to hear the reverb as an effect and not just as a subtle space around what I'm doing. Then there's spring that's often built into guitar amps. It has a very typical springy sound. You will notice when you hear it. What else is there? And then there are like specific specialized sort of things. But do some research, listen to some of these patches and the different types within each category and get a feel for what they sound like and what you personally like them on, because everyone's different. It's not that everyone needs to use a plate on a snare. Like you can do whatever you want. But just learn those things so you know what to reach for if you have a certain sound in mind. So that's my first recommendation. It always starts by picking the right sounds at the source, and that includes the right type of reverb. So with that out of the way, if you have a couple of different types of reverb now in your template, the way you want to do it is like Manel described. You want to put it on a dedicated effects bus, which means, and different DAWs call that differently. It could be called an aux track. It could be called an effects track. It could be called just a bus. It means it's a dedicated track where you put the reverb plugin on it, and you send to that track from any of your channels in the mix, and then you can blend the dry channel with the effects channel for the control of how much of the reverb you want. The difference to what many people are doing is that you don't put the reverb on the track itself. Like if you have a vocal track, for example, you don't put the plugin on the vocal track itself. You put it on a separate track that you can use the sends on the vocal track to send to, so that you have two tracks. One is dry, one has only reverb, and you can blend that way. If you do that, the mix knob on your reverb needs to be 100% wet, so that you have a 100% wet signal and a 100% dry signal, and with the faders, you balance them against each other. Why would you do that compared to putting it on your actual track? A couple of reasons for that. If you put it on the actual track, what happens is that it becomes part of the chain. So whatever happens in front of, like whatever happens after it more than anything, is going to affect the sound of the reverb as well. So if you put a reverb there and then after you EQ it and you make the vocal brighter, the reverb also is going to get brighter. If you compress the vocal, the reverb also gets compressed. So that is one part of it. If you have it on a separate track, you have individual control over how the reverb sounds and how the dry vocal sounds, or whatever you're sending to the reverb. That is one part of it. If you put it on the track itself, which you can do in theory, I would put it last and use the wet and dry knob on the reverb then to dial in the balance between the vocals and the reverb. But there are limitations to that approach. I know some people do it, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but there's a couple of advantages to not doing that. So one is the individual control over the two reverbs. Over the two channels, the reverb versus the dry. Another one is that, or it all comes back to individual control, but another one, for example, is that you can automate the level of the reverb really nicely by just moving its fader up and down. So you can have a drier verse by moving the fader of the reverb down, and then in the chorus you can push it up, and you can create like little tails at the end of a word by just riding the reverb fader, and you don't have to automate the mix knob on the channel. That is one thing. You can EQ them separately, like I said, you can compress them separately, and you can send the reverb to other things, or you can send other things into the same reverb, and you have more routing flexibility. And what this is called, this whole approach is called a send-return setup. So on an analog console, for example, you would have a bunch of channels that are pretty much all the same. you'd have the signal come in at the top, then it goes through the EQ, then it arrives at the sends, or maybe there's a compressor or whatever, but at some point it arrives at the sends. These are like little knobs, and you can use these sends to send to a different destination. Could be a monitor mix, could be an external effects device. So with an analog desk, you would connect an effects unit to a pair of extra tracks, and with the sends, you can send to those extra tracks. The signal goes out from there to the effects device, back into the desk on a separate track, and now you have control over reverb level and the dry level. That's how it works. And the same setup you can do in a DAW, and that's what these effects tracks are for, or the aux tracks. So things are running in parallel. So yeah. Do you have specific things, Manel, that you do that you can only do because of that bus setup that you have? Other than, I mean, it even is just practical to be able to have a template with preloaded effects on those tracks. That alone is an advantage, so that you can load in, different types of audio tracks, and your reverbs and all the other effects that run in parallel will already be in the template. But other than that, do you have specific things you do that are possible because of that parallel setup with a send and return?
Well, I think the obvious thing is that it's also a way to like blend different tracks in a way. I don't know, I see it as a similar thing to what a compressor can do with different tracks on a bus or something. It's like you can send 5 different vocals to the same reverb, and even more instruments, so that it feels that everything is in the same space to some extent. And for example, I use that. I always have also set up a room just in case I need to send some drums there for whatever reason, so that all the drums feel like in a room, right? And yeah, that's what I would say mostly in this case. Like, I don't use it for anything else than that, I think, or at least that now that I remember. Do you have any other uses of that?
Yes, totally. So I love that use case. So if you, like you said, you can put similar things into, or like you can put different things into a similar space. Like, for example, if you have a room there that sounds great, like great recording rooms, ambience type of stuff, you can make the entire band sound like they're playing together in a room by having one plugin on an effects track and then sending little bits of different pieces to that plugin, and you can send different amounts to that, so you can position something further back in the mix or more up front by using less of that same reverb, and you can do all of that with just one plugin. You don't have to insert the same plugin on every track and then have different amounts. You just have one effects track with that kind of ambience on it, and then you can say, okay, let me send my drum room mics to that because I want a bigger ambience. All right, let me now send a little less of my overheads to it because they also need to sound like they're in the same room, but just less. Then let me send a little bit maybe of the rest of the drum kit. Maybe I want to keep the bass dry, but my guitars will have a little bit of that. The vocal needs to be up front maybe, so I'm not going to do that, or maybe just a tiny touch. And you can create depth by sending different things to the same type of reverb with different amounts. So that's definitely a good use case. Another thing is that what I mentioned before is the ability to EQ the reverb, which is another thing that I definitely wanted to talk about on this episode, because this is going to fix most people's EQ reverb problems. Because if you just choose a reverb and then you just send something to it, chances are that it doesn't work the way it is. And a lot of people just pick a preset, pick something they think sounds good, and then run with it. If you have it on a separate track, you can EQ the reverb because it's just like a new instrument or a new part of the arrangement that comes into your song, and it needs to fit there, just like every other thing needs to fit. So it might need some carving, some EQing. And so what some of the most common mistakes that I hear when I give feedback on people's mixes is that they will use a reverb, and for example on a vocal, and then they don't clean up the low end or the low mids, for example, and the reverb really sounds thick and boomy and boxy, and it gets in the way of the vocal, and it's just too much in the low mid range. And sometimes you just have to roll off some of the bottom end, some of the lower mid-range to open it up a bit more and not clutter the mid-range too much. Another very common example is that when people choose a bright reverb especially, that the S's and consonants are really bright and harsh in the reverb, and you hear a clear s in the tail. And unless that's intentional, it's oftentimes pretty unpleasant, and it causes timing problems, perceived timing problems, because you have a clear rhythm with the consonants of the vocal and then slightly delayed with, you hear a tail of that S, and it just messes with the groove of the song, and you hear these sibilant reverb tails in the mix. And so oftentimes rolling off the top end or de-essing the reverb or notching out a harsh frequency is the move. Same with like a guitar. You might have a reverb that sounds really cool on an acoustic guitar to put it in some space, but maybe it sounds way too metallic and upper mid-range heavy, and you want a softer, warmer guitar tone. And maybe the guitar tone itself is fine, but the reverb makes it really harsh and upfront in the mid-range. And so by turning down 2 kilohertz, 3 kilohertz, whatever on the reverb, it will make it sound softer. It will put the reverb behind the guitar. And so you want individual control over the reverb, and you definitely, in most cases, or in many cases, want to EQ the reverb. So this is a big advantage. And yes, some reverb plugins have EQ built into them, but then also if you use the wet-dry knob, you're going to EQ the entire thing in a way, and it's just not as clear. If you have it on a separate track, you know that you're only EQing the reverb, and you have way more control because you can use your stock EQ or a fab filter or whatever. You can use as many bands as you want. You're not limited to the few controls that the reverb plugin might have. So that is another thing. Then the ability to, in general, just process it separately, where you might want to compress the reverb, for example, to keep it really quiet but always audible. That could be one thing. You might do the opposite. You could have an uncompressed vocal track. So maybe you have a vocal track that you compress and process like you want it in the mix, and now sending from that to the reverb makes the reverb sound too upfront. So what you can then do is you can duplicate the vocal track and send a copy that is uncompressed to that reverb, and you just turn down the dry vocal and you only use the reverb. That way you have a processed, compressed vocal that's going to be upfront, and an uncompressed vocal going to the reverb, which makes the reverb really dynamic, and it will sit behind the vocal, and it will make sure that when the vocal gets loud, the reverb gets louder. When the vocal's quieter, the reverb gets quieter, even after you heavily compressed the vocal and reduced its dynamics, if that makes sense. So you just have lots of routing options. And once you think it through and you are intentional about the decisions, the options you have with that setup are just way better than what you can do if you put it on the track itself. The other thing is, I don't do the grouping of things too much, like you mentioned. I do it if I want to put the entire band in the same room. That's what I sometimes do. Mm-hmm. But what I like is, I like to build chains of effects between the different like effects tracks that I have in my template. So for example, and I know you do a similar thing. So maybe I don't even want to send my vocal to the reverb, but maybe I want to send the vocal to a delay, and then the delay into a reverb, so that there's a little bit of space between the vocal and the delay, and then the delay is not super dry, but it has a tail, and so it steps back a little bit and sounds more ambient. And you can like chain different buses with effects on them together. You can group them together in that way, where you build custom effects chains without affecting the actual dry vocal or whatever you're sending to it. So I know you do a similar thing. You like the delay into a reverb kind of thing, right?
Yeah. I always have also delay, especially, 2 delays that go into a reverb. Yeah. So sometimes the reverb really comes from the delay and not directly from the reverb itself. Right?
Yeah, totally. And speaking of delays, that's the third thing I wanted to get to. So the first was the bus setup in general, the send and return. Once you discover what you can do there, you can solve most, if not all, of your reverb problems. The second one is going to be EQ and process your reverbs. Treat them like a separate instrument. Make it sit where it's supposed to sit in the mix. And the third one is use either a delay into a reverb or use the pre-delay knob on your reverb plugin and pay attention to what that sounds. And that's a subtle thing in the beginning. It's not too easy to hear, but you'll get the idea, especially if you overdo it a bit to learn what it does. Most reverb plugins will have a pre-delay knob. And that means you can set a time offset between the direct sound and then when the reverb tail kicks in. And why I want to do that? So if you don't use the pre-delay, you'll put the plugin on the vocal or you send the vocal to the reverb, whatever. The source will happen. It could be a snare, it could be a vocal, anything. The source will happen, and at the same time, the reverb happens. If you use a pre-delay, the source happens, and then 50 milliseconds after, or 100 milliseconds after, 20 milliseconds, whatever you choose, the reverb happens. The difference is the following. Imagine you're standing in a big room. And so let's just pretend Manel and I are in a big hall. And I'm standing here, and then Manel goes all the way back to the other side of that hall, and then he starts talking to me. What I will hear is, I'll hear Manel's voice coming directly at me, and then pretty much at the same time, I will hear the reverb from the walls next to Manel, because he's standing close to those walls on the other side of the room, and all the reflections and Manel's voice arrive pretty much at the same time at my ear. Even if I close my eyes, I can tell, because my brain knows those things, I can tell that Manel is standing far away from me. Everyone could tell, because we are just trained, we just know what that sounds like. And the reason why we know that is because the reflections and the direct sound pretty much come to us at the same time, and we can tell he's not close to us. That would be no pre-delay. If Manel is standing in the same room, and I'm standing in the same spot, but now Manel is standing next to me, really close to me, and starts talking to me, I will hear his voice really quickly at my ear, like directly next to me. And then the reflections from the room will arrive later because his voice has to go to the wall and then back at me. And so the reflections, especially from the walls far away, will take some time until they get to my ear. And now my ear knows, oh, Manel must be close to me because this direct sound is detached from the reflections of the room. There are other things in place, like how the voice actually sounds. There's more detail, probably. I hear more of the body of the voice. That is true. But even just the information about the reflection lets us localize where someone is in a room. We can just do that automatically. And if Manel is close to me and the reverb is further away, that would be a pre-delay. There would be a delay between when I hear his voice and when I hear the reflections of the room. And what that does in a mix now is, if I want something to be really upfront but still have a lot of reverb, I can use pre-delay and then use a lot of reverb, and it will still sound close to me because it's the equivalent of someone standing in a big room but close to me, and the reflections come delayed. And so I can use a lot of reverb without drowning the vocal, for example, in reverb, and without pushing it back too far in the mix. If I want the opposite effect, if something is standing out of the mix too much and I want it to blend in and move back in the mix, I can use no pre-delay, which will mix it immediately with the reverb, and it will move away from me and sound further away. That plus a few specific EQ moves, and you can create a front and back and some depth in your mix. And so definitely use pre-delay to create that kind of depth, which leads you to like a 3-dimensional sound rather than a 2-dimensional thing where everything's on the same level. So yeah, play around with that. And a similar thing would be to send it to a delay first and then the delay into a reverb. That would be like an automatic pre-delay kind of thing. So I hope this makes sense. Play around with this. It's not too easy to hear in the beginning unless you go too far. But like if you turn it up above like 100 or milliseconds or so, you'll obviously hear it. It will sound like an echoed delay. And then you can fine tune it and pay attention to how things move closer or further away, and pay attention to how much reverb you can use without drowning the vocal or whatever in reverb, and without pushing it too far back into the mix. So yeah.
Is there any use for reverb on a track that you normally use?
On the track itself?
Yep.
Yeah, sometimes I do it. So the first one, and I'm going to be honest, just like everyone else, the first one is when I'm lazy. When I have my template with my, my go-to reverbs that I can audition, and I have a couple of options for each, and I typically just use those. But sometimes, if I walk you through my template real quick, I have a drum ambience there, I have a plate for drums, I have a spring reverb for lead guitars, I have a room for rhythm guitars, I have a plate for vocals, I have like all these different kinds of reverbs, and then on each of those buses I have whatever, between 2 and 5 plugins, different ones of the same type that I can quickly audition. They are preloaded, and I can choose the one that I think works best for this mix. So this is kind of my setup. But sometimes I need something that's not in my template. I want something unusual. So, for example, the Raum reverb that you mentioned, this one's not in my template, and maybe I should add it. But this one's not in my template. I don't use it that often. But sometimes it just works really well on specific things. It's a great sounding reverb in general. And whenever I need that, for example, I love it on strings, on synth pads, like atmospheric stuff. It just has this long, lush, really nice tail that I just love to make things wider and bigger and longer. And so sometimes if I have something like that, I think that needs a little extra length and ambience to it, I might just go to that track, load up Raum, dial in the mix knob, 20% or something, and call it a day at the end of the chain. So I sometimes do that when I'm lazy. That's just an honest thing. I try to avoid it though, and whenever I find myself using something really often, it just goes to my template. Another example though, where I would want to have it on the track is when it becomes part of my virtual recording chain. So typical example would be certain types of guitar reverbs that I treat like pedals or amp reverbs. So if I think about it not as a stereo reverb on a separate track that will, usually they are white, they're stereo, I can send a guitar to that, it will create this ambience around it. If I want it to sound like it comes out of the guitar amp in mono and it's part of the guitar sound, then I will just put it on the guitar, put it in mono, use either a reverb pedal from one of the amp sims or use another reverb and just put it in mono, put it right there. And I just pretend, for example, a spring reverb, I just pretend it's the spring built into the amp, or it's a pedal in the effects loop, or it's a pedal in front of the amp. And so then I just think about it as one source tone that I'm crafting, and then I mix that entire thing as one tone. So that would be an example where I like it. Or when I pretend that something was recorded in a bigger room and I also want to treat it like it's been recorded that way. So if I have a pair of room mics that don't sound really roomy, I sometimes put an IR, like an impulse response of a good room, or some ambience or room reverb patch. I will put that directly on my stereo pair of room mics, blend it in with the mix dry knob, and then I just pretend that that's what the room mic sounded like to begin with. And then I just blend it in with the rest. So whenever I think it should be part of the source, I'll just put it there. And whenever I think it's part of my mix stuff, something that I'm adding to my mix to create depth and width and space, then it's going to be on my parallel effects tracks. That's how I look at it.
Mm-hmm. I sometimes use reversed reverb.
Oh yeah,
on some tracks. It's been a while now that I think about it that I haven't done that, but yeah, that's one use that I can think of, me using reverb on a track.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. And you probably have to automate it then, or you put just a single snippet on a separate track, right? Or do you have it's probably usually just in certain spots.
I would cut a little chunk and put it on a separate track. Yeah.
That's a good one actually. You're right. For specific effects like that, I do that too. I duplicate the track, I cut out a certain word or something, put it on the new version, and then put the reverb just there for that one word. That would be a thing. Yeah, totally. You're right. So yeah, those are my thoughts. And honestly, I know there's a lot more that goes into reverb, but honestly, if you just do these things, so you pick your reverb intentionally, you learn what the different reverb types actually sound like. You're aware that there are these different types, and they're pretty much the same in every single reverb plugin, with a few exceptions. And you learn the ones that you like for specific things. You just test them intentionally. You do some research. So that's where it starts. If you do that, and then you put it on a dedicated track that you can send to and run in parallel, parallel. If you're confused about that, look up send return effects, something like that. You will be able to Google that and just find and just try it out in your DAW. It's really a game changer. It's the same way that parallel compression works or any parallel effect. So that's the second one if you do that. And then if you realize that you can and should EQ the reverb in many cases, and that you can do more with it, like compressing, de-essing, and manipulating it separately from your source track. It opens up a whole new world of possibilities, and it will declutter your mix, it will de-ess your mix, it will make it smooth, it will make the reverb sit where it's supposed to be. So if you do that, and if you then mess with the pre-delay to create that sense of depth and be able to use a lot of reverb without drowning everything in reverb, those things combined will solve most of your reverb problems. My feedback always comes back to these things. Whenever I hear a muddy mix and they say, well, if I use it that way, it's muddy. If I do less reverb, it's too dry. My answer is usually EQ the lower mid-range so it's less muddy. Maybe separate it from the source so there's a little bit of pre-delay and separation. Maybe send an uncompressed duplicate to the reverb so it's not as upfront. It's always the same kind of tips. Or if the reverb is too obvious and sounds fake and dated and artificial, it's often too bright and you need to reduce the top end, find a darker reverb, or just de-ess it, EQ it. It's always the same types of things. And many times when I give this feedback and people don't know how to do it, it's because they have the reverb on the track itself and the options to do what I'm saying are limited. And once they move it to a separate track, all of a sudden it all works. So that's how it works. If you're really confused about the send return thing now, an easy way to start, it's not what I would recommend, but just to get the concept, an easy way to start would be put your plugin on the track itself where you typically have it, and then don't put it there. Do it differently. Like, process your track as usual, duplicate the track, put the reverb on the duplicate, and set it to 100% wet. So you'll have your vocal track, you just duplicate it, you put the reverb plugin on the duplicate, and you set it to 100% wet. Now on that second track, the duplicate, all you're going to hear is the reverb. You're not going to hear the dry. And now you can blend the dry against one that's 100% wet. It's the same type of effect. Once you get that, and what you can do now, you now only have to realize you don't have to duplicate your track. You just set up a dedicated track for the reverb that you can send all kinds of things to, and then you have the same sort of setup. That's how it works. And if you've ever done live sound or mixed a monitor situation for your band on stage or whatever, it's the same concept. You're using the sends to send different amounts of something to the different monitors for everyone. So send 1 might be the monitor stage left, send 2 might be monitor stage right, send 3 might be the drums, whatever. Same principle applies, but instead of sending to monitors, you're sending to an effects unit, and then the output of that comes back on a track. That's the same kind of principle. So yeah, that's all I have for today. I think there's plenty you can try. Let us know, as always, in the comments if you have any go-to reverbs that you really enjoy, things we haven't mentioned yet. I always love to hear about creative uses of reverb as well, because it's such an unlimited, world of things you can do. It's fun to play around with reverb. It's a very creative thing. So let us know if you have any specific stuff that you like. Let us know if you have more questions on that topic, if that was confusing, too technical. Anything else you want to add to this, Manel? Anything you do that we haven't covered yet?
Not really. There's a debate that I would like to start, but maybe not today, which is delay versus reverb.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not today. Would be too long.
Yeah, we have an entire episode on the topic that I did with Malcolm a while ago, I think, where we said, I'd have to look it up. I think there's an episode where we made the argument that oftentimes you should use a delay instead of a reverb. But yeah, that's definitely a debate we can have again in the near future, for sure. That took me too long to realize how powerful delays are. I didn't get it in the beginning, and now I use them more than ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't have a reverb on my pedal board, but I have a delay. Just saying.
See? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, true. And you can make the delay sound pretty much like a reverb, depending on how you set it. Yeah, totally. All right. Good. So if you again, if you are like, let us know in the questions, like we said, in the comments below, let us know your questions. If you're listening on the podcast, I think on Spotify, you can also leave comments now. You can always email us, podcast@theselfrecordingband.com. And if you're completely confused now and you're like, I need help figuring out what type of reverbs I need, how to use the plugins I have, I just don't get it, or I don't want to do the research, or I want someone to listen and tell me, try this or try that, please go to theselfrecordingband.com and apply for our coaching, because this is one of the things we do with the people in our program all the time. We can go through your template. We can build a template for you that works with your style. We can figure out what kind of ambience or obvious reverbs or whatever you want to use is good for your songs and your taste. We can analyze what your references are using. We do that often on our coaching calls with the entire group, where somebody is bringing some sort of reference to the call, and then the question is, how did they do this reverb? And then we analyze it and try to figure out how it's done. So you're going to learn a whole lot based on your own material if you work with us in the coaching. And the way to get there is to apply for a spot. We check if it's a great fit. Then we have a quick conversation. And then we can kick it off and help you make really cool records from your jam space. And you just do what you would do anyways, but with professional guidance. theselfrecordingband.com. Apply. And finally, and I know these are lots of like things that we make you do now, but finally, if you're in a different camp and you're like, I don't want to do this myself, it's cool to know about these things, but I'd rather have an experienced professional do that for me and pick those things, then you can hire a producer or mixer like Manel or myself. And Manel can make really tasteful decisions based on your arrangements, your taste, because it starts before the mix actually by just picking the right sounds, maybe, choosing the right spot in the room to record things, like all of that. If you want someone to do that with you remotely, Manel is your dude, and if it's about a mix, you can hit up either one of us to do that for you.
I think the only thing that we could maybe mention is that we take a lot of time to prepare your music for either producing or mixing, and that we always want to make it sound like you. We're not gonna try to make you sound like something else or whatever. So
good thing you mentioned that. Yes. That's one line that I repeat. I'm on these like calls every single week with people applying for our coaching. I do multiple of those every single week. And I always repeat this exact line. I'm always saying like, I'm interested in making your record, not my record. And you're totally right, Manel. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, it can, and all the template talk can often sound like, we're doing the same thing for every song. We're not. We're just using starting points, and we always figure out what you want things to sound like, what excites you, what your vibe is, and then we can use the techniques mentioned in this episode to intentionally create the right type of ambience and vibe for you, for your message, and make it sound unique to you. Or we show you how to do it if you work with us in the coaching, whatever you prefer.
Yep.
All right. So thank you for listening. We'll talk next week, and we appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.